Okay, so we're going to be continuing with chapter 13, and we're going to go over the sources of this genetic variation, right? So how evolution and adaptations actually come about. So basically the two responses are mutations and sexual reproduction, and we're going to go into each one into a little bit more detail now. So mutations are pretty much any kind of changes within your DNA sequence, and these changes are going to be permanent in the organism's DNA. And so some of these changes that happen can be heritable if those changes happen in the gametes or in the sex cells. Other changes aren't necessarily heritable. It's only those heritable mutations, the one that happens in the gametes, right, that can be passed down to offspring. So mutations are the ultimate source of genetic variation that serve basically as raw material for evolution. This is how we get new alleles, right? And nuances between different kinds of characteristics, like say you have blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes. Those are different nuances that have to happen because of new alleles that arise because of mutations. Again, though, in multicellular organisms, so what I was talking about before, these mutations have to happen in the gametes before they can be passed down. If you are a single-celled organism, which none of you guys are, obviously, but if you're like a bacterium or something like that, then of course the mutation can happen within that single cell, and then all of the progeny after that will have that mutation. It's just in multicellular organisms, basically sexual multicellular organisms, where the mutation has to be passed on to the kids, the offspring, and it can only you can only do that if, of course, the mutation happens in the gametes. A change as small as one single nucleotide, so one single subunit of the DNA, can basically change the protein that the DNA encodes and therefore give you a really significant effect. You guys remember back in chapter 10, I believe, we went over the mutations and how with sickle cell anemia, it was literally one single nucleotide that changed. And so we went from having normal hemoglobin, which happens in normal adults, and then people that suffer from sickle cell anemia have that one single chain, and therefore they have sickle hemoglobin, which is abnormal. So you can have small mutations, right? They could be point mutations where only one single nucleotide gets changed, or you can even have large ones. Large ones basically are the ones that are going to affect the entire chromosome, right? So we have additions or deletions. And so basically, in essence, there's all of these are different kinds of mutations, and what a mutation is just a change in one or more alleles. Okay, so the rate on the mutations is actually quite low, and this is a good thing because not most mutations aren't good for us, right? But some mutations that do arise are beneficial, and these are the ones that do not cause us harm, and they're the ones that help us with survival and reproduction, and therefore help us evolve and adapt. So most mutations are not likely to account for much of the change in allele frequency that is observed in the population, but some are adaptive. So this is rare, again, but they're important. So rarely do we have mutations. Even more rare is it when we have a mutation that is actually beneficial for us, and that mutation is what we then we basically have to change and to alternate and adapt our genetic information. Okay, so it's the process of many of these mutations, even though they're rare, many of these mutations that allows us to completely change specific characteristics. And this is why evolution takes such a long time. Okay, some of the mutations, like chromosomal mutations, like the big ones, the ones that delete, disrupt, or rearrange the chromosomes, are most certainly to be harmful. However, sometimes you have duplication of these larger chromosomal regions, and when we have duplications, that can give us basically a source of, again, genetic variation, because you have now a new gene, right? You have two genes from that because it was duplicated, and now one of those two genes can go ahead and carry out many different mutations without actually harming the organism as much, because you still have the backup gene to help you out. In prokaryotes, right, so bacteria or archaea, mutations happen really quickly, adaptations happen really quickly because the mutations don't necessarily have to happen in just one type of cell. Remember, they're single cells, they don't have gametes. And so as long as it happens in that cell, they're going to pass on that mutation. Well, we have to have our mutations within our gametes in order to pass them on. And so because of that, it takes us a lot longer. The average mutation in animals and plants, we average about 1 in every 100,000 genes per generation. it's also between animals and plants, we usually have longer time spans between generation. And then of course we had that diploid genome and the whole fact that our mutations aren't passed on unless they occur in our haploid gametes. So it takes a lot longer for animals and plants. The next thing that is important for genetic variation is of course sexual reproduction. So in organisms that reproduce sexually, most genetic variation in a population results from the unique combination of alleles that each individual inherits. So from the mom and the dad. So sexually reproducing organisms, we have like two partners, right? And so you have this combination and this mix of genes from the mom and the genes from the dad. So you basically get this fresh assortment of existing alleles that arises every generation from 3 random components of sexual reproduction. Remember, we have independent orientation of homologous chromosomes, that independent assortment that happens in metaphase 1 of meiosis. We have crossing over that happens in meiosis 1 and prophase 1, and then which is, remember, where the homologous chromosomes sometimes they go ahead and switch over some portions of the genes with themselves, with each other, and then of course random fertilization. Random fertilization. Okay, so in organisms that reproduce sexually, most genetic variation populations result from the unique combination of alleles that each individual inherits. I already went over all of this. Okay, sorry. I thought I was going forward, but I didn't. So watch this video to understand genetic variation, and yeah, so that's basically the point of genetic variation. We get it from sexual reproduction and from mutations. Now let's look about some key points. Let's move on and look at some key points about natural selection. So of course, natural selection affects individual organisms, but it's not the individual who evolves, right? I do not evolve throughout my lifetime. I do not evolve. I can adapt, but these adaptations, unless they happen in my gametes, they do not get passed on to my offspring. So what actually evolves is a population of a group of organisms. So this evolves over time as adaptive traits become more common in the group and other traits change or disappear. This is probably going to be a trick question on the exam in Twin Quick. So evolution refers to generation changes in populations, not in a single species. It's more of a population, because even if I do adapt, right, if I die, that adaptation is gone. It has to be passed on to my offspring and then my offspring. And so all of a sudden I have a population of humans that have this particular adaptation. Okay, so basically a population of that's the part that's adapting, right? That's the part that's adapting. And so in essence, the whole thing that's actually evolving is a sorry, hold on. Yeah, the population in which the thing is working on is actually evolving. So no single individual evolves. It's also incorrect to say a species evolves, right? And remember, a species is a group of organisms that can successfully interbreed with one another in nature, but that do not successfully interbreed with members of other such groups. So for example, why is a cat different from a dog? Because they cannot interbreed. Okay, so those are two different species. So it's also the species that do not evolve. And this kind of scenario right here helps you understand that it is actually population. So you can see how we have one single frog, right? One single frog species. And then they used to live in this original environment all throughout this little forest. There was a drought, right? That caused an expansive barren terrain. And then out of random chance, a group or a population of that frog went to the right, and a group or a population of that frog went to the left. Now, again, out of chance, this top part had more rain than this bottom part, so the vegetation looks different. So this was darker green and this is lighter green. And so of course, the offspring of this particular frogs that had lighter coloration were picked and survived more than any kind of darker coloration frog. Well, it was the opposite here. The darker coloration frog, because of its darker surroundings, it survived more than the lighter coloration frog. And so you can see how it's a population that is adapting and the population is evolving, right? It's not one single species, it's a species within a population. So each populations get modified separately over time, each evolves, and eventually they will evolve so much over time, right, with gene shuffling, addition, deletion, etc., that they will maybe and most probably speciate and each form those two populations of frogs. they may go ahead and form two different species. Okay, so population is all the members of a species that live in a defined geographic region at a given time. So at a given time. So it's a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area and interbreed. So now we have, we basically have like the population of individuals in Auburn, right? And if we were at CMCC and in our classroom, we would be a population of humans in that classroom at CMCC. So it just depends on where, on like the area that you put, right? That basically tells you what a population is. Okay, so an example of like these isolation, like a true example of something like this happening actually occurs a lot with lakes. So a lot of these lakes, like here you see lakes in Alaska, a lot of them used to be it used to be one single lake, and then expanses of barren terrain came in and like, you know, closed off the lakes. And so of course we have a population of fish here and a population of fish here. Each is going to adapt depending on like whatever environment it has to go through. And so eventually this fish is going to adapt, evolve population-wise, right, into probably new species. And this fish population is also going to probably adapt into another species. Okay, so moving on to gene pools and evolution. So remember, these are just a couple of reminders. Genotype is just the genetic makeup. It's just what your genes say of the organism. And that this genetic makeup, this DNA, is going to be the underlying basis for the phenotype. Phenotype, remember, starts with ph, so it talks about physical characteristics and kind of behavioral characteristics as well. So the genotype dictates the phenotype. And remember, the genotype is based on the genetic makeup, which is always two alleles. There's always two alleles to one gene. Okay, so each offspring inherits one allele from the father and one allele from the father or the mother. So when you look at a population and you look at all of the alleles for that specific gene, there can be more than two alleles to a given gene in a population. This is known as a gene pool. So take, for instance, humans, right? You probably have, let's pretend that the blue eye allele, so for blue eyes, the blue eye allele is recessive and the brown eye allele is dominant, okay? So if I have one brown allele and one blue allele, I'm still gonna have brown eyes. Thing is though, brown and blue are not the only things there. We also have green eyes, right? We also have hazel eyes. We have light brown. We have all sorts of, we have like, you know, dark brown, all sorts of eyes. Those are all different alleles. And so all of those alleles that exist in one population, in my eye example, it's a population of humans, that's known as the gene pool. And this is very important in evolution because all evolutionary change pretty much is based off of that. So you can kind of imagine evolution as a card game and your gene pool as just a deck of cards, and whatever deck of cards you have or card hand you have is going to dictate your phenotype. Okay, so the gene pool concept can help us understand allele frequencies, which are the root of evolution. So if we go back to that frog example that we saw before, remember the two frogs, one darker colored one and one lighter colored one. A frog inherits from his mother and father a darker coloration, which helps it evade and camouflage itself from predators better than brightly colored frogs, and so lives a longer life and makes more offspring than the other frogs. Therefore, the advantageous set of alleles is inherited. So in this case scenario, it's a frog in that darker kind of forest, and you need the darker alleles to help it evade the predators. Because this darker allele, like darker frog, is more successful in breeding, since it can last longer, it's going to be more successful at breeding, and it's also going to pass on its alleles to the next generation. And so more than other frogs are disadvantaged, like had a disadvantage. So say like frogs that are light colored in that situation, they're probably not going to live long, and so they're probably not going to have a chance to give off as many offspring with that light coloration. So there's an increase in allele frequency for the darker coloration alleles in the frog population. Okay, so it's this allele frequency that is the basis of evolution, and we can actually figure out which alleles are, actually prevalent in gene pools. We can analyze gene pools and see if the dominant allele is more prevalent, if the recessive allele is more prevalent, etc. This is known as a Hardy-Weinberg formula, and you will not have to know how to use this formula for the exam. However, you can see, right, that like you can basically figure out the frequencies of all of the alleles that a population may have for one specific gene using the Hardy-Weinberg formula. Okay, so then we move on to microevolution. Okay, so microevolution is the change of allele frequencies. Since we're talking about the gene pool, now it's going to be the change of allele frequencies in a population over a relatively short period. So micro, remember, means little. So it's basically small little populations. It's different from macro. Macro is big. Macro are big changes, like going from dinosaurs to birds kind of thing. Those are big changes. Micro are small changes like the coloration of a frog. Okay, so evolution is any genetically based phenotypic change in a population of organisms over successive generations. You can take a step back and large-scale patches become visible. Okay? And these large-scale patches are known as macroevolutions, where new species and new large groupings of living things come about. So again, like example of birds coming from dinosaurs or mammals coming from reptiles, so big things. But microevolution is more about these small adaptations, these small mutations that happen. And it's these small mutations that happen that then bring about macroevolution. Okay, so forces that can bring about changes in allele frequency, so forces that are behind microevolution is gene flow, genetic drift, and of course, natural selection. So let's look at each one into more detail. So the first one is genetic drift. Okay, this is basically, is this all a matter of chance? Genetic drift is instability of small populations. I'm going to underline this because this is really important. Genetic drift only really has an effect on small populations and not on big ones. So as you can see here, let's use this as an example. Actually, let's go back and let's read what genetic drift is. Okay, so genetic drift is a chance alteration, so it's all up to random chance, of allele frequency in a gene pool, in the population's gene pool, with such change having the greatest impact on a small population. Okay, it can happen in a large population, but it's not really going to have an effect, and therefore it's not really going to have an effect on microevolution. So chance events have much greater effects on small populations than larger ones. So this genetic drift, what is it? It can happen in two ways. The first one is the bottleneck, okay, where the population greatly decreases through disease or natural disaster. This is an example of the bottleneck. So let's pretend we have two different populations of penguins. And these red penguins have, I don't know, some weird wax coating that allows them to swim better in the ocean, okay? So as you can see here, we have 10,000 penguins, and there's 1,000 that are red, and just 10%, technically, that means 10% of the penguins, the allele frequency of the penguins, have the red, fancy, waxy, swimming allele. In a smaller population, we have 10, and only 1 out of 10 has that waxy complexion. But still, technically, our allele frequency is 10% because 1 out of 10 is equal to 10%. So technically, these allele frequencies are the same. So now what happens if there's an earthquake? If there's an earthquake, the ice breaks, the ground opens up, and a bunch of penguins just fall in. Now, in the large that's basically genetic drift. That's that chance event. In a large population, this isn't going to cause that many issues because basically there's enough red alleles, right, to go around that even if the majority of them go away, so 50% of the population survives, and 450, right, out of the 1,000 carriers of the red allele die. So if that's the case, we're still okay, right? Because we're basically at 450 divided by 5,000. That's about 9% allele frequency. So we still have that possibility of these red alleles, these red waxy alleles, to go ahead and, you know, like make more offspring, reproduce, make more offspring, and pass on that allele. So the genetic drift does not really affect the large population that much. However, in a small population, so this again wipes out half of the population. Let's say, for example, in that half of the population, this one of the ones that dies, this little red penguin. Little red penguin dies. Guess what? That allele now is completely lost. So our allele frequency for that red waxy ability to swim better in the ocean is 0 out of 5. It's 0%. So you can see how genetic drift, which is this chance event, has a really bad effect on smaller populations. This is another example, okay, the bottleneck. This used to be a population of these elephant seals, right? And then in the 1890s, there was a lot of, they were hunted a lot for their blubber oil. So they were hunted and hunted and hunted. And again, this is a chance event. They were just all like, randomly shot, and about a few remaining seals were left. And out of those few remaining seals, as you can see, there were only the brown ones and the white ones. The black and the gray ones were all dead. And so because the black and the gray ones were all dead, these alleles are permanently lost, forever lost. And so even though afterwards they started trying to protect the species because the species was about to go extinct, even after they did that, the species only had a few alleles to really, like when they mated, they only had a few alleles to really like shuffle and juggle around. And so with that, we no longer have those black and gray alleles that are part of the elephant seal. So now the small sample of alleles is likely to, because we have a small sample of alleles here, is likely to use a gene pool that's different from the distribution found in the original larger population. That's what the genetic drift bottleneck effect is. We also have genetic drift founder effect. Founder effect is when instead of like killing off a bunch of people or individuals in a population, it's actually a small group of that population migrates and goes and forms a little colony up by themselves. So when a small subpopulation migrates to a new area to start a new population, it is likely to bring with it only a portion of the original population's gene pool. So sampling is caused by the migration of few individuals rather than by surviving of a few individuals, which is what we have with the bottleneck. You have surviving of a few individuals in the bottleneck. In the founder effect, you have the migration of a few individuals. So for example, I don't remember the actual date, but a small group of people migrated from Helsinki, which is the capital of Finland. Okay, they migrate all the way up to northern Finland because for some reason they were like, nope, we're done with the city life. So they migrated all the way up. This was a small group of people. Imagine about 10 people. So when you have 10 people in the middle of nowhere where there's no other humans in contact, okay, these individuals are going to interbreed. And so whatever alleles you have in that group of 10, those alleles are going to be the ones that show up more and more. In fact, one of those individuals was a carrier for a specific eye disease. And so because between that 10 group of people, they kept reproducing between each other, many of the offspring ended up having that really rare eye disease. And so you can see that the inherent value of genetic diversity is extremely important. And so like compared to something like isolated interbreeding, which is what you have for the founder effect. This is why we need to really like mix, okay? So the founder effect is when you have migrations, and then those people that migrated are going to make a population of their own. And that population, the alleles of the gene pool of that population are going to come from the genes found in the original migrated population. So the other thing that contributes to microevolution is gene flow. Gene flow is really easy to understand. It's just literally the movement of genes from one place to another. So it's the migration of genes from one population to another. For example, take me first, right? I have my Italian genes. I moved from Italy to America, and eventually when I have offspring with my husband, this is a horrible example, but you know what I mean. I am literally bringing my genes from Italy to America. This is gene flow. So it takes place through migration, the movement of individuals from one population into the territory of another. Okay, so unfortunately, my kids are probably going to be very bad at withstanding the cold, right? Because I bring that factor, or they may be very good as long as they take it back, as they take the alleles from my husband. So it's just gene flow is just basically moving the genes that you normally find in one population, like the Italian population, to a new population like the American population. So my kids are going to be cold, loud, unruly, all the horrible things that really characterize Italians. Okay. Remember though, this migration is not just limited to humans, nor is it just limited to animals. This also applies to things like plants, right? Winds and like water currents can also can bring seeds and everything to different places and migrate the seeds. So not necessarily does the person or the individual have to be mobile in order to migrate the seed, its genes. Plants that are obviously not mobile can move their gene flow, like their genes as well. And then of course we have natural selection. So natural selection is basically the last of the things that contributes to microevolution. And so natural selection, however, of the three, genetic drift, gene flow, and natural selection is the only one that really allows for adaptive evolution, okay? So with genetic drift and gene flow, not necessarily are we contributing to the offspring's adaptation. So not necessarily are they going to adapt well to the environment. Take, for example, me, right? Remember with my gene flow example, I am bringing in my Italian genes. Those Italian genes are not very suited for the harsh winters of Maine. So those, my kids are not going to be very well adapted to those colder conditions. Does that make sense? So I may bring good things, right, from Italy. Like I may bring, I don't know, whatever good genes I have, but I may also bring bad genes. So not necessarily is gene flow like good. Same thing for genetic drift. Not necessarily is it good. It can be good. So back when we went to with the red penguin, when we had that earthquake, in the example I gave, the red penguin died. So that's obviously not good. You've lost those good alleles. But it could also be that the red penguin actually has the alleles for a disease. So when we have the earthquake and that red penguin dies, it's actually for the better. So with genetic drift, it can also be, it's just basically 50-50. So gene flow is 50-50, good or bad, right? Genetic drift is 50-50, good or bad. Natural selection is always going to help us adapt to our environment. So this is the only one that allows us to actually adapt. So natural selection, like in a positive way. Natural selection, again, is a process through which traits that confer a reproductive advantage to individual organisms grow more common in populations of organisms over successive generations. And again, we go back to that frog dark coloration example. The key concept in natural selection is adaptation, which is a modification in the form, physical functioning, or behavior of the organisms in a population. So basically the phenotype of an organism in the population over generations in response to the environmental change. Okay, so for example, an environmental change may come to a population like streams drying, right? Or a population may come to an environmental change like migration. All these things are going to contribute to how you adapt or how that population adapts. Only natural selection consistently leads to adaptive evolution. So remember, gene flow and genetic drift, 50-50. Could be good adapting, could be bad adapting. So natural selection is always going to consistently lead to good adapting towards the environment. So natural selection is a processing which populations can adapt to new environmental conditions. Among all three agents, and I already said this before, but among all three agents affecting microevolution, natural selection is the only one that consistently works to adapt a population. With genetic drift, it's random. With the gene flow, again, it's random. You're not necessarily bringing good traits or good genes over. Okay, so natural selection does not produce the perfect organism. So even though we are adapting to our environment, it doesn't necessarily produce the perfect organism. What it ends up doing is actually producing the organism that is more fit. And fitness is something that students kind of have difficulties understanding because they think of fitness as, you know, being mighty and strong, because that's what physical fitness is, right? When you go to the gym. But fitness isn't necessarily that. What it actually means to be the survival of the fittest, which is probably something you have heard of, survival of the fittest just means that you have the ability to make more offspring, because by making more offspring, you are passing down your genes more, like more of your genes towards your offspring, towards that population. So fitness is the success of an organism in passing on its genes to offspring relative to other members of its population at a particular time. So, right. So the more offspring you have compared to another organism, the more fit you are. All right. So organisms are not deemed fit if they have thousands of offspring. There can only be more or less fit than their neighboring organisms, or basically their neighboring members of that population. So for example, my grandma had 7 kids. Okay. I have no kids. She is, if I compare myself to her, she is more fit than I am. Okay. So this has to do with allele frequency in the gene pool. No matter how many offsprings an individual has, its allele frequency will only increase in a population only if it has more offspring than the other members of its generation. So that's why we have to compare fitness, because you're only ever better than someone if you have, not better than someone, but better than another individual organism, if you have more of an opportunity to pass on your genes. So the survival of the fittest phrase is often misunderstood. This is not about being superior or large or mighty or strong. It's simply about having more offspring than other people. This is another video that I think you guys should, videos that you should watch. Okay. All right. So next, I'm going to talk about sexual selection. So sexual selection is when mating is uneven across a population. Sexual selection is when it's a type of natural selection, but this time you're not really taking into consideration the environment, you're taking into consideration what the mating partner prefers. So it's basically, it's reproductive success based on differential success in obtaining mating partners. So for example, you see this a lot with birds, right? The more flamboyant and the more attractive a male bird is, the more chance that female bird has to choose that male bird and therefore have offspring with it. Okay, so this is basically based on completely on the phenotype of the attraction level of the organisms involved. So here I have an example of male peacock, nice plumage, right? So then it has nice feathers. This is chosen more by the females over the males with less extravagant feathers. Why is this a big deal? Because even though the male peacock with the nice feathers is really elaborate looking, right, and attracts all the females, it may actually have issues, right? It may not be the fastest peacock in flight. I don't know. May not be the fastest peacock. In fact, the fastest peacock is the one with the less extravagant plumage. But because of sexual selection, the females don't really take this into consideration. They're only kind of like honed into attraction. And so they will probably mate with the one that has nicer plumage, but is slower. And so, of course, because of that, they don't really adapt. They don't adapt for the better. They don't adapt to be faster or anything like that. Okay. You can see it in birds, you see it a lot, like with not just like physical appearance, but also with behavior. So strutting and chest swelling. So sometimes a female chooses who it's going to, make offspring with depending on the behavior of specific birds, of specific male birds. You can also see is a combative ability. So with like between lions or something like that, which ones want more? So if one male mates 4 times as much as the average male of his generation, his alleles tend to increase proportionally in the next generation. So again, those alleles aren't necessarily good, just like my example of the peacock. Sexual selection is a form of natural selection in that some alleles, those that help bring about attractiveness, for example, are preferentially selected. However, it doesn't help with any of the other genes. So this is the main difference between natural selection and sexual selection. Sexual selection is just differential mating, depends on attractiveness, and that's it, be it behavioral attractiveness or physical attractiveness. Natural selection has to do with differential survival and reproductive capacity. So it has to do with any kind of gene that just makes the organism more adapted, like have more of an advantage in that particular environment. Okay, so here you have an example of sexual selection and how it brings about sexual dimorphism, which is just a fancy way of saying there's a male and a female and they look different from each other, even though they're the same species. So in a more common type of sexual selection, individuals of one sex, usually females, are choosy in selecting their mates. So in this example right here, the female is actually this one, the blue one, and then the male is actually, you see all this fancy kind of physical plumage in order to attract the female. And that happens a lot in the animal kingdom. So moving on to modes of natural selection. So in what direction can natural selection push evolution? And that just, it depends on the type of what we're looking at, because it can push evolution in 3 ways. So first off, this is all has to do with polygenic traits. If you remember, polygenic traits, kind of like height or skin color, they're under the control of many genes. And so we don't really have 2 options, right? We have a variety of different nuances and hues of options, a variety of different heights, a variety of different skin colors, a variety of different hair colors, etc. Those are polygenic traits because you have more than one gene that is affecting them. So we can have natural selection when it works on these polygenic traits. It can proceed in 3 ways. We can either have stabilizing selection, directional selection, or disruptive selection. So stabilizing selection is when the intermediate physical appearance, like the physical trait, is the one that is preferred. So for example, with human birth weights, okay, the babies, infants that are newborns that are very, very are very, very light, so they don't weigh a lot. They have less than 4 pounds, right? They tend to not survive as much. You can see here, this is percent of the infant deaths. It increases if a baby is less than 2 pounds. Look how high the percentage is, about more than 70% of death, right? If the babies are also extremely large, that complicates things very much, right? And so also that leads to a lot more death. And so basically you see that usually, right, you have more infants, newborns that are kind of in the middle range, because being really, really small is problematic, being really, really big is problematic. And so natural selection is going to specifically select only the middle intermediate traits, so being average size, and it's going to move away from the extremes and move towards the average. Okay, so therefore this is why it's called stabilizing, because it's moving away from the extreme, it's moving towards the average. This is known as stabilizing the selection. This is usually the most common type of natural selection we have. Another type of natural selection is directional. That's when we go to one extreme or the other. In this example right here, we're looking at the skulls of like humans and our past hominin relatives, which are now extinct. As you can see, our skulls just got bigger and bigger and bigger. This is basically toward going when natural selection moves towards one extreme, because we realize that it's more important for us to be kind of like have more functions of the brain, and so our skulls got bigger and bigger and bigger. Then we have disruptive natural selection, and this is the last kind of natural selection. And this is when either extremes are favored and the intermediate is not favored. Okay, so when natural selection moves a character towards both extremes. So for example, beaks in particular birds in Africa. Okay, so these finches in Africa, these birds in Africa, they have two beak sizes. They either have small beaks or they have large beaks. Why don't they have beaks in the middle? Because the small beaks are really good at picking up the small seeds and eating those. The large beaks are really good at picking up larger seeds and eating those. Intermediate, they would kind of be good at both, right? They'd be good at both, but since the smaller beaks are getting rid of, they're doing such a good job at getting rid of the small seeds, and the larger beaks are getting so good at getting rid of the larger seeds, they really, the intermediate guys are at a disadvantage, right? So basically, the intermediate is going to have to compete with both the small beaks and the large beaks. So they have to compete with both extremes. And so because of that, with natural selection, it will be disruptive and go, the intermediate trait is basically going to be weeded out, since it's always going to have to be in competition. This occurs, it's one of the most rare types of natural selection. So usually natural selection is stabilizing. You can also see directional selection as well. Disruptive selection doesn't happen as often. That's it for chapter 13, and I shall see you guys in the next video. Bye guys.